Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to my second Victober wrap-up. I've had kind of a crazy week, sadly, reading less than I would like, and also watching less BookTube and making fewer videos than I had planned for the week. I hope this week will be a little smoother and that I can catch up a bit. During Victober, I want to start each weekly wrap-up video by telling you about the tea I'm drinking that day, a tradition inspired by Catherine at the BookTube channel Taking Tea with Catherine. A few weeks ago, I ordered a couple of special fall teas from Harney & Sons. Today, I'm drinking their New England Breakfast, a black tea infused with maple. Although I'm drinking it straight today, which is how I typically drink tea, I've also had this with a touch of sugar and milk, and it's a lovely and comforting treat. I'm drinking my tea today from one of my favorite pottery mugs, one that was given to me by my college roommate right after we graduated. She had commissioned one of her best friends from high school, an amazing potter, to make cups like these for her friend in honor of a special occasion. I've used this mug really regularly for decades now, and I hope I'll be able to for quite a bit longer. It's a perfect size and shape for a good cup of tea. Well, as for reading, I spent a lot of time this past week reading a forthcoming biography of the author H.G. Wells, who wrote a series of what he calls scientific romances at the tail end of the Victorian period. Although I know I read The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds when I was a preteen, and then listened to the radio broadcast of War of the Worlds perhaps in my 7th or 8th grade classroom one Halloween, I haven't thought much about Wells since then. On a drive last Monday, I convinced my spouse David to listen to the first part of a recording of The Time Machine, and the book really fascinated me. Let me say first that we were listening to something I downloaded from Hoopla, one of my free library services, and the recording was really awful, full of mispronounced words said repeatedly, which was pretty distracting. I haven't looked it up yet, but I hope this was a volunteer effort. If someone was kind enough to make a copy for LibriVox, wonderful. If it was a professional production, yikes. Anyway, the biography I read was for a formal written review, which will come out at roughly the same time the book is published at the end of the month. I can't really talk about it here now, but I promise to link to the review once it is up on the review website. All in all, the book did not make me like H.G. Wells as a person very much. But as I read his work and read more about him in other sources, I was utterly intrigued by what he was doing. From a fairly early stage in his life, H.G. Wells was involved in political movements in England, opposing the monarchy and supporting socialism. He was also really interested in the study of science and had even written a science study guide / textbook before he ever published a novel. He was writing in an era where scientific discoveries and technological advancements were developing really rapidly. So when Wells sat down to write his first novels, when he was about 30 years old, he used these scientific romances to talk about the class divisions and other social problems he saw in his own world. In The Time Machine, Wells tells the story of a scientist who travels to a society far in the future where humans have effectively evolved into two groups, a weak but privileged leisure class who live in a pastoral setting, and a working class who labor underground, just as England's poor found employment laboring as miners in coal pits and as servants, quote, below stairs. I suppose all of you who know more about science fiction than I do will not be at all surprised to see such direct links between the social concerns of an author's era and the social concerns that the author writes about in his or her novels. As I was reading, it occurred to me that Wells was fascinated by the project of world building. When he imagined the places and landscapes that inhabited the places he wrote about in his novels, and when he worked to reconstruct the world in which he lived himself as a political writer. Well, while I was really intrigued by my reading of and about H.G. Wells, I'm significantly more enamored by the other two books I'm reading right now, The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope and Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. I'm afraid I'm quite behind on the schedule I'd set to get through the two very long novels over the course of the month, but my plan is to do a lot of reading later this afternoon and during part of the evening. I mentioned last time that I'm hoping to do some knitting while I try out audiobook versions of both books. Daniel Deronda is read by the brilliant narrator Juliet Stevenson, and The Way We Live Now is read by Timothy West. While I've done some knitting, I have done it while watching the Great British Bake Off, not while listening to Victorian literature. But I have found myself listening to hours of each novel in the middle of the night with the lights out. Quite often in the past, I've listened to a bit of BookTube or occasionally a bookish podcast as I'm preparing for sleep. And this month I've decided to listen to an audiobook instead. I've had a bit of trouble sleeping lately, partly due to absolutely unnecessary stress I was feeling about a writing project, and partly because of the nighttime screeching of a pair of very loud barred owls that have kept my entire neighborhood awake half the night. More on that in a future video if my midnight audio recording comes out properly. But back to the point. When I can't get myself back to sleep, I've been turning on Juliet Stevenson and Timothy West to keep me company. West is great, terrific at creating characters and voices that seem to fit perfectly with the plot line and with Trollope's writing style. Similarly, Juliet Stevenson is, in general, an inspired choice for reading George Eliot. She seems to be channeling that voice in a way that makes it almost seamless for me to go back and forth between reading the physical book and listening to the audiobook. My one complaint about the Stevenson reading is that the main young female character has a higher, squeakier voice than I personally think she should have. But I can live with that, given that her voicing of the other significant young female character has more depth to it than my own imagining did. I say all this as if I know what I'm talking about when it comes to audiobooks, and really nothing could be further from the truth. I very much enjoyed listening to books while on long drives, but only in the last 2 years have I really listened to many audiobooks when I wasn't in the car with my husband and or son. Initially, I often found it so frustrating that I almost always either abandoned the books or switched to print partway through. Then I tried nonfiction on audiobook and loved it. What a surprise. And now both these audio novels are really working for me. We'll see if this continues. Reading these two novels, The Way We Live Now and Daniel Deronda, is just an amazing experience. Before I started, I knew that both books would give me some insight into how Jews and Judaism were portrayed in Victorian fiction, but the two books have quite a bit more in common. Both books are very much about money. In The Way We Live Now, we get a picture of finance built on lies and on fraud. Trollope uses images of gambling and speculation to build his case that the system of finance is fundamentally about greed. Daniel Deronda is a bit more subtle. Here we see images of both literal and metaphoric gambling as well. But in Eliot's book, the financial system is built not on fraud or greed per se, but on dangerous or unwise speculation. Eliot is more pointedly talking about the dangers of gambling rather than Trollope's condemnation of greed. I say this having read slightly less than half of each book, so perhaps my opinions on this will change as I continue. Early in Daniel Deronda, risky financial speculation, which happens offstage, leads to the financial straits that Gwendolyn Harleth and her family experience. The situation is incredibly similar to what happens in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. A woman and her daughters are forced to try to create a life on a much lower rung of the economic ladder than they're used to. But Gwendolyn is not an Austen character, and neither is the man she decides to marry, thinking he will save her and her family from their crisis. On the other hand, I think Gwendolyn is in some ways similar to some of Trollope's women, perhaps especially Mrs. Hurtle, whom we get to know a bit in the second quarter of The Way We Live Now. Both women are strong and independent in some ways, but also craving both support and love in ways that are not always healthy for them and perhaps not fair to the people around them. Trollope's Mrs. Hurdle is the gunslinging, manipulative woman from America who definitely garners the reader's sympathy, despite her sometimes questionable moral choices. And Gwendolyn is the arrow-slinging, manipulative woman who garners sympathy despite her moral flaws and missteps. And both women, I think, are going to have to deal with the fact that they might not end up with the men they are in love with. If you haven't read these two books, this might be kind of an off-putting conversation, and for that I apologize. I think the larger point here, though, is that what books we read with each other or what we read back to back often really influences what we get out of a book. I'd love to hear if any of the rest of you have had experiences like this, where two books you're reading at relatively the same time seem to be speaking to each other so clearly. Well, thank you for joining me today for this second Victober catch-up. I hope all of you are enjoying the month as much as I am. Coming up over the next couple of weeks here, I hope to film the last part of my Q&A, which I am so sorry to have put off for so long, a nonfiction November TBR, a second edition of the Mooks and Gripes tag with answers that are not written by dead white men, and perhaps sort of a vlog-type rambles video where I'll tell you a bit about what I've been doing besides reading and writing. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.